The year is 1861. Across the nascent American landscape, a feverish tension gripped a nation teetering on the precipice of its own undoing. Secession had ripped the fabric of unity, and the cannons at Fort Sumter had finally torn it asunder. When Abraham Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion, the prevailing sentiment in both the North and the South was one of swift, decisive victory. Few, if any, envisioned a conflict that would rage for 4 agonizing years, claiming the lives of over 600,000 Americans and forever scarring the national psyche. This was to be a short war, a quick surgical strike to restore order or to secure independence. But this illusion, this profound miscalculation, became the first great tragedy of the American Civil War. The North, with its overwhelming industrial might, larger population, and established government, seemed to hold all the cards. Its advantage in railroad mileage, manufacturing capacity, and naval power appeared insurmountable. Many in Washington believed that a single, crushing defeat of the Confederate Army would send the rebels scurrying back to the Union. They underestimated the depth of Southern resolve, the profound conviction among secessionists that their way of life, built upon the institution of slavery, was under existential threat. Conversely, the South, despite its agricultural economy and smaller white population, was fueled by a fierce, almost fanatical belief in its right to self-determination and the perceived superiority of its martial culture. Southern leaders, many with extensive military experience, believed that Northern shopkeepers and merchants lacked the fighting spirit to wage a protracted war. They also banked heavily on European intervention, particularly from Great Britain and France, whose textile industries were heavily reliant on Southern cotton. The notion was that a quick, glorious defense of their homeland would force the North to concede. This widespread optimism, bordering on delusion, shaped the initial strategies of both sides, leading to a series of critical early decisions that, far from bringing a swift conclusion, inadvertently guaranteed a prolonged and horrific struggle. The Union's initial approach, largely driven by political necessity and a desire to avoid alienating potential Southern Unionists, was characterized by a hesitancy to strike truly decisive blows. This soft war approach, advocated by figures like General Winfield Scott with his Anaconda Plan of blockade and gradual constriction, was fundamentally at odds with the speed and brutality required to crush a passionate rebellion. While strategically sound in theory, it lacked the immediate punch needed to dislodge the Confederates' fervent commitment. On the other side, the Confederacy, despite its defensive posture, often sought battle on its own terms, utilizing superior generalship and a more motivated, albeit smaller, fighting force in the early stages. They were fighting on their home soil, a significant advantage in terms of morale, logistics, and knowledge of the terrain. Early Confederate victories, such as the First Battle of Bull Run, further cemented the belief in the South that their cause was just and their triumph inevitable. The summer of 1861, filled with parades and patriotic fervor, quickly gave way to the grim realities of war. The eager volunteers, many having enlisted for a mere 90 days, soon discovered that war was not a glorious adventure but a brutal, attritional grind. The scale of the conflict, the sheer number of men mobilized, and the nascent technologies of warfare, from improved rifles to early forms of ironclads, meant that battles would be bloodier and more protracted than anything the nation had ever witnessed. The political climate also played a crucial role in preventing a swift resolution. In the North, Lincoln walked a tightrope, attempting to preserve the Union while grappling with the morally fraught issue of slavery. His initial war aim was explicitly to restore the Union, not to abolish slavery. This cautious stance, while designed to keep border states from seceding and to maintain a fragile political consensus, inadvertently gave the Confederacy a clearer, more unified purpose in defending their peculiar institution. The fundamental misunderstanding of the enemy's resolve, coupled with strategic hesitations and a misjudgment of the conflict's true nature, set the stage for a protracted war. The single decision, or rather the collection of early decisions born from this initial misjudgment, that ensured the prolongation of the slaughter, was the failure to immediately and unequivocally adopt a total war strategy. Instead, both sides entered the conflict with limited aims and a naive expectation of a quick end, thereby signing a bloody contract for 4 years of unimaginable suffering and transformation. The illusion of a quick war, therefore, became the very crucible in which the true, horrific nature of the American Civil War was forged. The optimistic declarations of a swift victory faded rapidly after the first Battle of Bull Run. For the Union, this humbling defeat served as a harsh awakening, a brutal splash of cold water on the face of Northern complacency. The notion that a single decisive engagement could end the rebellion was shattered. General Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan, initially derided as too slow and cumbersome, suddenly gained an uncomfortable, if grudging, respectability. This plan, envisioned by the aging hero of the Mexican-American War, proposed a strategic blockade of southern ports, effectively choking off the Confederacy's economic lifelines, combined with a thrust down the Mississippi River to split the rebellious states in two. It was a strategy of constriction, of slow, deliberate strangulation, rather than a swift, surgical strike. The decision to largely pursue the Anaconda Plan, albeit with varying degrees of commitment and speed, became the Union's primary strategic framework in the early stages. While it avoided the catastrophic risks of a direct, immediate overland invasion of the South, it also implicitly accepted a longer war. Lincoln, ever the pragmatist, understood that popular opinion, especially after Bull Run, would demand more direct action, but the inherent difficulties of invading and occupying a vast, hostile territory made Scott's cautious approach seem, at least to some, the only viable long-term solution. The blockade, though initially porous, slowly tightened its grip, a silent and relentless weapon eroding the South's ability to trade cotton for essential war materials and foreign currency. Every captured blockade runner, every closed port, was another twist of the Anaconda's coils, but this was a slow death. The Confederacy, for its part, understood the implications of the Anaconda. Their gamble lay in time. They believed that if they could inflict enough defeats on the Union, demonstrate their unwavering resolve, and hold out long enough, European powers, particularly Great Britain and France, would be compelled to intervene. Cotton, they reasoned, was king. The vast textile mills of Manchester and Rouen relied heavily on southern raw materials. A cotton famine in Europe, they theorized, would force diplomatic recognition, military aid, or even direct intervention on the side of the Confederacy. This belief, this fervent hope for foreign intervention, profoundly influenced their early military strategy. Rather than a purely defensive war, the Confederacy often sought to strike blows that would influence European opinion. The strategic brilliance of commanders like Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson in the Eastern Theater, coupled with their willingness to take calculated risks, yielded early victories that, while not strategically decisive in ending the war, certainly prolonged it by boosting Southern morale and raising hopes of foreign recognition. Victories like the 7 Days battles and Second Bull Run, though costly, projected an image of Southern strength and military prowess. These victories, however, also inadvertently reinforced the Union's determination to fight on, transforming the conflict from a limited engagement into a full-blown struggle for national survival. The decision by the Confederacy to actively seek engagements, often on Northern soil, was a desperate gamble for international legitimacy. Lee's pushes into Maryland, Antietam, and Pennsylvania, Gettysburg, were not merely defensive maneuvers. They were attempts to win a battle on Union territory that would be so resounding, so humiliating for the North, that it would force European recognition of Confederate independence. These were strategic gambles with immense stakes. While Antietam ended in a tactical stalemate that provided Lincoln the opportunity to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, a critical turning point we will explore later, it did not achieve the European recognition the Confederacy so desperately craved. Gettysburg, of course, was an unmitigated disaster for the South, marking the high tide of the Confederacy and definitively ending any realistic hope of foreign intervention on a grand scale. The Anaconda Plan, slow and methodical as it was, began to take its toll. The Union's control of the Mississippi River, culminating in the capture of Vicksburg in July 1863, effectively split the Confederacy in two, isolating the western states and severely disrupting Confederate logistics and communication. This was a direct result of the long-term strategy of constriction. The blockade, too, grew increasingly effective, gradually starving the South of manufactured goods, medical supplies, and even basic necessities. Inflation spiraled out of control in the Confederacy, and the ability to equip and sustain its armies became an ever greater challenge. Meanwhile, in the North, the initial clamor for a quick end slowly gave way to a grudging acceptance of the grinding nature of the conflict. The war became one of attrition, a test of wills and resources. Lincoln, despite the immense political pressure and the staggering casualty lists, remained steadfast in his commitment to preserving the Union. His willingness to endure, to keep replacing generals until he found those willing to fight the kind of total war necessary for victory, was a key factor in prolonging the conflict, paradoxically, to ultimately end it. The strategic choices made by both sides in these early years, the Union's slow embrace of constriction, and the Confederacy's desperate gamble for European intervention, created a bloody stalemate. Neither side was strong enough to deliver a knockout blow, nor weak enough to simply capitulate. This mutual tenacity, born from differing hopes and fears, ensured that the slaughter would continue, extending far beyond the 90-day enlistments of 1861 and into the long, dark years ahead. The stage was set for a prolonged and agonizing struggle, marked by immense human cost and profound societal transformation. As the initial fever of patriotism cooled, replaced by the grim reality of casualty lists and stalled offensives, the strategic debates within both Union and Confederate high commands intensified. At the heart of these debates lay a fundamental dilemma. Could this war be fought as a limited conflict, or would it inevitably descend into a brutal struggle for total annihilation? The choices made by commanders, often under immense political pressure, profoundly shaped the war's duration and its horrific human cost. For the Union, particularly in the Eastern Theater, the early war years were defined by a succession of generals who, consciously or unconsciously, adhered to a concept of limited war. George B. McClellan, the young Napoleon, epitomized this approach. A brilliant organizer and drill master, McClellan meticulously built the Army of the Potomac into a formidable fighting machine. However, his fatal flaw was an acute aversion to decisive, bloody engagements. He consistently overestimated enemy strength, moved with agonizing slowness, and sought to win battles through maneuver and the threat of overwhelming force, rather than through direct, crushing blows. His Peninsular Campaign, a grand amphibious flanking maneuver designed to capture Richmond, bogged down in cautious advances, missed opportunities, and ultimately retreat. McClellan's strategy was rooted in a belief that the Confederacy could be compelled to return to the Union without utterly destroying its societal fabric. He sought to minimize casualties on both sides, believing that a lenient peace would be easier to achieve after a less destructive conflict. This sentiment, while perhaps noble in intent, was utterly unsuited to the realities of a rebellion fueled by deep-seated ideological convictions. His repeated failures to pursue retreating Confederate armies to capitalize on tactical advantages directly prolonged the war. Each missed opportunity allowed the Confederacy to regroup, rearm, and fight another day. In contrast, Confederate commanders, particularly Robert E. Lee, initially embraced a more aggressive, though still not total, approach within the constraints of their defensive war. Lee understood that his smaller, less well-equipped army could not win a war of attrition against the industrial might of the North. His strategy often involved taking calculated risks, concentrating forces, and seeking to defeat Union armies in detail, often through audacious flanking maneuvers and bold offensives. His aim was to deliver such stinging blows that the Northern public would tire of the war and demand a negotiated peace. Victories at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, achieved against superior numbers, reinforced this aggressive defensive strategy and demonstrated the potent threat the Army of Northern Virginia posed. However, even Lee's aggressive style had its limits, particularly in terms of logistics and manpower. His invasions of the North were ultimately aimed at shifting political opinion and securing foreign intervention, not at conquering and occupying Northern territory. He was playing a different kind of limited war game, one focused on political rather than purely military objectives. The turning point in this strategic dilemma for the Union arguably began to emerge with the rise of figures like Ulysses S. Grant in the Western theater. Grant understood, perhaps more instinctively than his Eastern counterparts, the brutal math of this conflict. He recognized that the Confederacy possessed a powerful will to resist, and that only by systematically destroying its military capacity and its ability to wage war could the Union achieve victory. His campaigns in the West, Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, Shiloh, Vicksburg, were characterized by relentless pressure, a willingness to accept casualties, and an unyielding determination to pursue objectives until achieved. He was not afraid of the slaughter, because he understood it was the only path to eventual peace. The contrast between McClellan's cautious maneuvering and Grant's relentless aggression became starkly evident. Lincoln, frustrated by the lack of progress in the East, increasingly sought a general who would fight. The constant rotation of commanders in the Army of the Potomac, McDowell, McClellan, Pope, McClellan again, Burnside, Hooker, Meade, was a testament to the Union's struggle to find a commander willing and able to prosecute the war with the necessary ferocity. Each change in command, each new general learning on the job, further fragmented Union strategy and bought the Confederacy more precious time. The political realities of 19th century warfare also contributed to this dilemma. Commanders were often beholden to political considerations, public opinion, and the need to maintain morale. A general who needlessly sacrificed his men or suffered a major defeat risked his career and public support for the war effort. This pressure, while understandable, often led to a cautious approach that ultimately cost more lives in the long run. Ultimately, the decision to prolong the slaughter was not a single, isolated choice, but a complex interplay of strategic philosophies. The Union's early adherence to a limited war approach, driven by a hope for reconciliation and a fear of massive casualties, allowed the Confederacy to survive and even thrive on its initial defensive successes. Conversely, the Confederacy's strategic gamble on foreign intervention, which necessitated aggressive actions, also tied them to a form of limited war, one aimed at political outcomes rather than total conquest. It was only when the Union fully embraced the concept of total war, under commanders like Grant and Sherman, that the path to a decisive, albeit horrific, end became clear. The failure to adopt this total war mindset earlier was, perhaps, the most significant strategic oversight that ensured the prolonged and bloody conflict. As the war dragged on, the initial strategic blunders and the shifting philosophies of command gave way to a more brutal, undeniable reality. This would be a war of attrition. The conflict ceased to be about maneuver and decisive battles alone, transforming into a gruesome contest of wills, manpower, and industrial capacity. The North's inherent advantages in population and manufacturing began to assert themselves with devastating clarity, fundamentally shaping the trajectory and duration of the slaughter. The Union possessed a population of roughly 22 million, compared to the Confederacy's 9 million, of which approximately 3.5 million were enslaved people. This numerical disparity, while evident from the outset, became increasingly critical as casualty rates mounted. While both sides initially relied on volunteers, the sustained losses soon necessitated conscription. The Union's Enrollment Act of 1863, though deeply unpopular and leading to riots in New York City, provided a mechanism for replenishing its ranks. The Confederacy, having implemented a draft even earlier, by 1862, faced a much smaller pool of eligible men, especially as its territory shrank and its economic base eroded. The South's reliance on slave labor, while providing a backbone for its economy and freeing up white men for military service, also presented a profound vulnerability. As Union armies advanced, enslaved people often seized opportunities for freedom, depriving the Confederacy of labor, and in many cases, actively aiding the Union cause as spies, guides, or laborers. This loss of an essential labor force further strained the South's ability to sustain its war effort. Beyond raw numbers, the industrial might of the North was a relentless, ever-growing engine of war. Union factories churned out rifles, cannon, uniforms, and ammunition at a rate the agrarian South simply could not match. Northern railroads efficiently moved troops and supplies, a stark contrast to the South's fragmented and increasingly dilapidated rail network. The blockade, slowly but surely, stifled the South's ability to import crucial materials, leading to chronic shortages of everything from boots to medicine to gunpowder. Southern soldiers often fought barefoot, with antiquated weapons and on increasingly meager rations. The impact of this resource disparity was profound. Every major battle, regardless of who claimed tactical victory, inflicted irreplaceable losses on the Confederacy. While a Union regiment could often be replaced relatively quickly by fresh recruits and new equipment, a Confederate regiment, especially one comprised of seasoned veterans, was a far more precious and irreplaceable asset. The North could afford, in a grim statistical sense, to lose more men. This grim arithmetic of attrition became the silent, pervasive force prolonging the war. Each time the Confederacy managed to push back a Union offensive, or even win a tactical victory, it came at a price it could ill afford. Take, for example, the Overland Campaign of 1864. Under Ulysses S. Grant's relentless command, the The Army of the Potomac engaged Lee's Army of Northern Virginia in a series of brutal, continuous battles. The Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, Cold Harbor. These were not battles of grand maneuver, but of frontal assaults, trench warfare, and unimaginable slaughter. Grant accepted staggering casualties, understanding that for every Union soldier lost, Lee was losing a man he could not replace. Lee's tactical genius kept his army intact, but it was bleeding out slowly but surely. Grant's strategy was not to avoid battle, but to constantly engage, to bleed the Confederacy dry. This was total war, fought through the sheer, brute force of superior numbers and resources. The Confederate decision to continue fighting, despite the mounting evidence of an unsustainable struggle, was driven by a complex mix of defiant pride, a deep-seated belief in their cause, and the desperate hope that Northern resolve would break first. They banked on the war weariness of the Union populace, the mounting opposition from Copperheads, and the upcoming presidential election of 1864. If Lincoln could be defeated, they reasoned, a peace candidate might emerge who would grant them independence. This hope, however slim, fueled their continued resistance and prolonged the agony. The human cost of this attrition was astronomical. Battlefields became charnel houses, and hospitals overflowed with the wounded and dying. Disease, more than combat, was the greatest killer. Families on both sides endured agonizing suspense, awaiting news of loved ones, often receiving only the stark reality of a death notice or the devastating impact of an amputation. The landscape of the South, particularly, became a testament to the war's destructive power, with farms burned, railroads torn up, and cities laid waste. The specter of attrition hung heavy over every strategic decision. For the Union, it meant a grim determination to see the fight through, understanding that victory would ultimately come through sheer endurance and the application of superior force. For the Confederacy, it meant a desperate, losing battle against an insurmountable tide, a slow retreat towards inevitable collapse, each day bringing them closer to total ruin while simultaneously prolonging the suffering. The grinding, relentless nature of this war, born from the North's demographic and industrial advantages, and the South's stubborn, defiant resistance, became the central, agonizing feature that stretched the conflict from months into years, extending the slaughter beyond all initial comprehension. The initial declarations of war on both sides articulated seemingly straightforward objectives. For the Union, it was the preservation of the nation, the sacred trust of a government of by and for the people. For the Confederacy, it was self-determination, the defense of states' rights, and inextricably linked, the preservation of their peculiar institution of slavery. But as the conflict deepened, as blood flowed in torrents across battlefields from Manassas to Shiloh, the moral landscape of the war began to shift, a profound transformation that would, perhaps more than any other single factor, prolong the slaughter by fundamentally altering the Union's objectives. When Abraham Lincoln issued his inaugural address, he explicitly stated, "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists." This was a pragmatic political stance, designed to retain the loyalty of the crucial border states, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, and to avoid alienating Northern Democrats who, while supportive of the Union, held no abolitionist sympathies. The war, for the first year and a half, was officially fought solely to restore the Union. However, the grim realities on the ground began to challenge this narrow definition. Union soldiers, marching through Southern territory, encountered enslaved people firsthand. Many enslaved individuals, sensing an opportunity for freedom, fled to Union lines, seeking protection and offering invaluable intelligence. These contrabands of war, as they were initially called, presented a moral and logistical dilemma. Were they property to be returned, as per the Fugitive Slave Act, or were they persons to be freed? Commanders like General Benjamin Butler, facing this conundrum, declared them contraband, refusing to return them to their owners, arguing they were Confederate property aiding the rebellion. The sheer hypocrisy of fighting a war for freedom and democracy while simultaneously upholding the institution of slavery became increasingly apparent. Abolitionists in the North, long marginalized, gained a more powerful voice. Radical Republicans in Congress pressed for stronger measures against slavery, passing acts like the First and Second Confiscation Acts, which allowed for the seizure of Confederate property, including enslaved people used to support the rebellion. Lincoln, always a masterful politician with an ear to the ground, recognized the evolving public sentiment and the strategic imperative. The war was proving far costlier and more protracted than anyone had anticipated. Slavery, the root cause of the conflict, was also a vital resource for the Confederacy, providing labor for farms and factories, and freeing white men for military service. Striking at slavery would be a blow to the Confederacy's economic and military backbone. Furthermore, an explicit anti-slavery stance would make it virtually impossible for Great Britain and France, abolitionist powers, to intervene on behalf of the Confederacy. The timing was crucial. Lincoln needed a Union victory to issue such a momentous decree from a position of strength, not desperation. The Battle of Antietam in September 1862, though a tactical draw, was strategically sufficient. It halted Lee's invasion of Maryland and provided Lincoln the political leverage he needed. On September 22, 1862, he issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that as of January 1, 1863, all enslaved people in states or parts of states still in rebellion against the Union shall be thenceforward and forever free. This was the transformative decision. The Emancipation Proclamation immediately and irrevocably changed the nature of the war. It was no longer merely a struggle to preserve the Union. It became a moral crusade against slavery. For the Confederacy, this meant that there could be no negotiated peace that preserved their cherished institution. The stakes were raised exponentially. The war became, for the South, an even more desperate fight for survival, against an enemy now committed not just to victory on the battlefield, but to the eradication of their foundational social and economic system. The reaction was immediate and polarized. In the North, while celebrated by abolitionists and many Union soldiers, it was met with fierce opposition from Copperheads and some Democrats who feared it would prolong the war and lead to a racial conflict. Many soldiers who had enlisted to preserve the Union now found themselves fighting for a cause they hadn't initially signed up for. Desertions increased in some units. Yet for many, particularly African Americans, it provided a powerful new impetus. Black men, previously barred from military service, now eagerly enlisted in the Union Army, forming regiments like the famous 54th Massachusetts. Their bravery and determination on battlefields like Fort Wagner proved their commitment and added a powerful new dimension to the Union war effort. In the South, the proclamation was met with outrage and condemnation. It was denounced as a barbaric act, an invitation to slave insurrection, and proof that the North intended to utterly destroy their way of life. It solidified their resolve to fight to the bitter end, to resist any outcome that would result in the abolition of slavery. The prospect of losing everything, of their entire social order being upended, fueled a desperate and tenacious resistance. The Emancipation Proclamation, therefore, solidified the terms of conflict. It ensured that the war would not end with a compromise or a political settlement that allowed slavery to persist. It transformed the fight into a struggle for fundamental principles, elevating the conflict beyond mere territorial dispute to a moral imperative. This decision, strategically astute and morally profound, guaranteed that the American Civil War would be fought to its most brutal conclusion, a fight to the utter destruction of one system or the triumph of another, undeniably prolonging the slaughter, but also ensuring a more just, if agonizingly achieved, outcome. Amidst the thunder of cannon and the crackle of rifle fire, another, far more insidious enemy stalked the camps and battlefields of the American Civil War. It was an adversary that dwarfed the casualties inflicted by bullets and bayonets, claiming more lives than all the grand charges and desperate defenses combined. This unseen foe was disease, and its catastrophic impact on both Union and Confederate armies was a pervasive, yet often overlooked, factor in prolonging the slaughter. The 19th century stood on the cusp of modern medicine, yet lacked its fundamental understanding of germ theory, sanitation, and sterile practices. Armies, by their very nature, were incubators for illness. Thousands of men, often from rural backgrounds with little prior exposure to common infections, were crammed together in unsanitary camps. Contaminated water sources, inadequate diets, poor hygiene, and swarms of flies became vectors for contagion. The result was a horrific litany of ailments: typhoid fever, dysentery, measles, mumps, smallpox, pneumonia, and malaria. For every soldier who fell on the battlefield, at least 2 and often 3 succumbed to disease. Take the example of dysentery. The primitive latrine arrangements, the proximity of water sources to waste, and the consumption of spoiled rations meant that diarrheal diseases ravaged regiments. Men would waste away, their bodies weakened, their fighting spirit extinguished not by enemy fire, but by the relentless grip of intestinal infections. Typhoid fever, often spread by contaminated food and water, was another silent killer, causing delirium, internal bleeding, and a slow, agonizing death. The medical response, though valiant by the standards of the time, was woefully insufficient. Army doctors, often overwhelmed, operated without antiseptics, leading to rampant infections in even minor wounds. Amputation, a swift and brutal procedure performed with unsterilized saws, was the most common form of major surgery, often leading to gangrene and sepsis. Field hospitals were often little more than improvised shelters, lacking basic sanitation, where the wounded lay in close proximity, creating a perfect environment for the spread of disease. The sheer scale of the sickness devastated unit strength and readiness. Entire regiments could be rendered combat ineffective not by a frontal assault, but by an outbreak of measles. Commanders constantly grappled with dwindling numbers, not just from battle, but from sick calls that would deplete their ranks far more extensively than any engagement. This constant drain on manpower meant that offensives often had to be delayed or scaled back, allowing the enemy time to regroup. A Union army might be on the verge of a breakthrough, only to be hobbled by a widespread fever, buying the Confederacy precious weeks, if not months, of respite. Conversely, for the Confederacy, disease was an equally devastating, if not more so, impediment. With fewer resources, poorer access to imported medicines due to the blockade, and often less developed medical infrastructure, their armies were particularly vulnerable. The lack of quinine for malaria, for example, rendered many southern camps in swampy areas veritable death traps. The continuous attrition from sickness chipped away at their already limited manpower, making the replacement of experienced soldiers even more difficult. The constant influx of sick and wounded back home also placed an immense burden on the already struggling civilian population, draining resources and morale. The psychological impact of disease should also not be underestimated. Soldiers lived in constant fear, not just of the enemy's bullets, but of the invisible killer lurking in their water, their food, and the air around them. This pervasive dread contributed to low morale, desertion, and a sense of hopelessness. A strong army could be demoralized and weakened from within without a shot ever being fired. The grim statistics tell the story. For every soldier killed in battle, at least 2, and more likely 3, died from disease during the Civil War. This ratio highlights the true nature of the attrition. The war was not just fought on battlefields, but in the squalid camps, in the crowded hospitals, and in the fever-ridden tents. The medical ignorance of the era, the primitive sanitation, and the sheer logistical nightmare of supplying and maintaining massive armies in the field created conditions ripe for endemic illness. This unseen enemy, disease, prolonged the slaughter by constantly degrading the fighting strength of both armies, forcing delays, consuming resources, and slowly bleeding the nation dry, one fevered breath at a time. It added another layer of horrific, unavoidable cost to the conflict, ensuring that the path to victory for either side would be paved not just with the dead of battle, but with the silent, forgotten multitudes who succumbed to the invisible war within the ranks. The medical catastrophe of the Civil War was, therefore, an agonizing, pervasive force that stretched the conflict into years of unimaginable suffering. The relentless toll of battle and disease was not confined to the distant front lines. Its chilling ripple effects spread inexorably to the home fronts, north and south. As the war stretched from months into years, the initial patriotic fervor and the illusion of a quick victory dissipated, replaced by war weariness, economic hardship, and growing dissent. The internal struggles and fading support on the home fronts became a critical, though often overlooked, factor in prolonging the conflict, as both governments grappled with their population's diminishing will to endure the slaughter. In the Union, the initial enthusiasm for the war gradually soured under the weight of mounting casualties and the implementation of conscription. The draft, particularly the Enrollment Act of 1863, was deeply unpopular, seen by many as an infringement on personal liberty and an unfair burden on the poor, who could not afford to pay the $300 commutation fee to avoid service. This resentment exploded into violence in July 1863 with the infamous New York City draft riots, where ethnic and class tensions, fueled by anti-black sentiment and anti-war rhetoric, transformed the city into a battleground. Thousands of federal troops, fresh from Gettysburg, had to be diverted to quell the insurrection, demonstrating the fragility of home front support. The Copperheads, a faction of anti-war Democrats, capitalized on this growing discontent. They argued for an immediate negotiated peace, often appealing to racial prejudices and fears of economic competition from freed slaves. Prominent Copperhead voices, like Clement Vallandigham, openly criticized Lincoln's administration, the Emancipation Proclamation, and the conduct of the war, further eroding public confidence. Lincoln skillfully, if controversially, employed measures like the suspension of habeas corpus to suppress dissent, arresting thousands of suspected Copperhead sympathizers. This authoritarian streak, though deemed necessary for national survival, further fueled anti-war sentiment. Economically, while the North largely prospered due to war industries and agricultural innovation, inflation was a concern, and families endured the anxiety of absent loved ones and the stark reality of death notices. The political landscape became increasingly fractured, with Lincoln facing fierce opposition from within his own Republican Party, as well as from the Democrats, leading up to the critical election of 1864. The prospect of Lincoln's defeat and the election of a peace candidate was the Confederacy's last great hope for avoiding total defeat. This internal division, this ongoing debate over the legitimacy and purpose of the war, undeniably stretched the conflict, as it continuously gave the South reason to believe Northern resolve would eventually break. In the Confederacy, the home front experienced an even more profound and debilitating collapse. While initial unity was strong, fueled by a shared sense of grievance and a fierce determination to defend their homeland, the South's agrarian economy was ill-equipped for a prolonged total war. The Union blockade, combined with the loss of territory, led to devastating shortages. Food became scarce, prices skyrocketed, and widespread inflation rendered Confederate currency almost worthless. The common soldier's family back home faced immense suffering, often teetering on the brink of starvation. The rich man's war, poor man's fight sentiment, fueled by exemptions from conscription for slave holders, bred bitter resentment among the non-slave-holding white majority. Desertion rates among Confederate soldiers soared in the later years of the war, as men abandoned their units to return home and protect their starving families. Women, left to manage farms and households with little support, often wrote desperate letters to their husbands, begging them to come home. Internal divisions, though less overtly political than in the North, festered. State governors often prioritized local interests over the needs of the Confederate central government, hoarding resources and undermining Richmond's authority. Bread riots erupted in cities like Richmond, as desperate women protested the exorbitant food prices and government inefficiency. The morale of the civilian population, once unwavering, began to crack under the relentless pressure of deprivation and loss. The Emancipation Proclamation further inflamed the South, but it also solidified the war's purpose. For many, it truly became a fight for their way of life, however morally indefensible that way of life was. Yet, as the war dragged on and defeat seemed increasingly inevitable, this defiant resolve began to fray. The Confederate government's inability to adequately feed and supply its armies, coupled with the collapse of its economic system and the growing internal dissent, directly impacted its ability to sustain the fight. In a grim symbiotic relationship, the suffering on the home fronts prolonged the conflict by creating internal pressures that both sides had to constantly manage. For the North, it meant a struggle to maintain political unity and popular support, giving the South hope that they might simply outlast their adversaries' will. For the South, it meant a slow, agonizing internal collapse, where the very foundations of society began to crumble, yet their leadership refused to concede, dragging the population through ever-deepening despair. The fading support and growing dissent on both home fronts thus became yet another layer of complexity, stretching the brutal slaughter beyond the point of reason, as two societies were pushed to their absolute breaking points. Beneath the grand strategies and the political machinations, the American Civil War was also a brutal proving ground for emerging technologies, transforming the very nature of warfare. This rapid, often haphazard, adoption of new weaponry and methods of destruction played a critical, if often overlooked, role in prolonging the conflict. The advancements, far from delivering a swift knockout blow, frequently created a more lethal stalemate, ensuring that the slaughter would be more extensive, more efficient, and agonizingly drawn out. The rifle, specifically the rifled musket, was perhaps the most impactful technological innovation. Prior to the Civil War, most infantry were equipped with smoothbore muskets, accurate only at short ranges, perhaps 50 to 100 yards. The rifled barrel, however, imparted a spin to the mini ball, a conical bullet designed to expand into the rifling grooves. This simple innovation dramatically increased accuracy and effective range to 200, even 300 yards. Soldiers could now be killed or wounded from distances previously considered safe. The implications were catastrophic for traditional linear tactics. Napoleonic-era charges, with massed infantry advancing shoulder to shoulder, became suicidal. A single line of defenders armed with rifled muskets could decimate an attacking force long before it reached close quarters. This increased lethality led to a tragic irony. While individual battles might be indecisive, the casualty rate soared. Commanders, clinging to outdated doctrines, repeatedly sent their men into impossible killing fields, leading to horrific slaughter and stalemates that extended the war. Frontal assaults, exemplified by the Union's repeated failures at Fredericksburg or the Confederate charge at Gettysburg, became synonymous with mass death. Beyond the rifle, artillery also saw significant improvements. Rifled cannon, like the Parrott rifle and the Whitworth, offered greater range and accuracy than their smoothbore predecessors. Shells designed to explode over enemy formations, or case shot, filled with musket balls, became devastating anti-personnel weapons. While artillery could still not win a battle outright, its increased destructive power contributed to the overall lethality of the battlefield, adding to the psychological trauma and physical toll on soldiers. The advent of rudimentary machine guns, such as the Gatling gun, though not widely deployed or decisive in the Civil War, hinted at the terrifying future of automated firepower. More immediately impactful were the improved logistics afforded by the widespread use of railroads and telegraphs. Railroads allowed for the rapid movement of troops and supplies over long distances, enabling larger armies to be deployed and sustained, thus contributing to the scale and duration of the conflict. The telegraph allowed for faster communication between commanders and their political leaders, though interpretation and effective use of this new speed were still in their infancy. Naval warfare also underwent a revolution. The introduction of ironclads, armored warships like the USS Monitor and the CSS Virginia, Merrimack, rendered wooden navies obsolete overnight. The clash of these two titans at Hampton Roads demonstrated the vulnerability of traditional naval power and inaugurated a new era of naval construction. While naval superiority ultimately aided the Union blockade, the development process and the inherent limitations of these early ironclads also meant that they were not immediate war winners, rather contributing to a complex naval chess game that stretched out over years. Even seemingly minor innovations had an impact. Improved medical instruments, while still primitive, allowed for more surgeries. The development of early trench warfare techniques, as seen in the Petersburg siege, reflected the adaptation to the increased firepower of the rifle. Soldiers dug in, seeking cover, transforming battlefields into static, attritional grinding zones. This led to prolonged sieges and extended periods of bloody, indecisive fighting, rather than quick resolutions. The fundamental paradox of these technological advancements was that they made it easier to kill, but not necessarily to win decisively. They increased the defensive power of an entrenched force, making offensive operations incredibly costly. This created a cycle of attrition. Commanders threw more men into the meat grinder, hoping to overwhelm the enemy through sheer numbers, only to find the new technologies magnified the slaughter without guaranteeing a breakthrough. The failure of both sides to fully grasp the implications of these new technologies, particularly the rifled musket, and to adapt their tactics accordingly, ensured a protracted and immensely bloody conflict. Generals continued to order charges that were tactical suicide, believing that courage and bayonets could overcome lead and steel. It was a brutal learning curve, one paid for in oceans of blood. Thus, the technological crucible of the American Civil War forged not a quick end, but a deeper, more agonizing quagmire. The innovations in killing, rather than shortening the war, made it more lethal and more difficult to conclude, ensuring that the slaughter, already prolonged by strategic and political factors, would be magnified by the very tools designed to bring victory. The conflict became a horrifying testament to humanity's capacity for destruction, perpetually pushing the limits of endurance. The early years of the war saw Union commanders struggling to grasp the nature of the conflict, often clinging to conventional military doctrines that proved woefully inadequate. The repeated failures to deliver a decisive blow, the frustrating cycles of advance and retreat, and the mounting casualties without commensurate gains led to a period of intense trial and error. This arduous process of learning to fight and the eventual embrace of ruthless, total warfare by key Union generals was a pivotal development that ultimately shortened the war, but only after it had been significantly prolonged by earlier hesitancy. George McClellan, as discussed, epitomized the cautious approach. His meticulous planning and logistical brilliance were undeniable, but his pathological overestimation of enemy strength and his aversion to battle robbed the Union of early opportunities. His persistent belief that the Confederacy could be defeated without massive destruction, or a soft war, meant that he never fully committed to the brutal necessity of crushing the rebellion utterly. This reluctance to pursue, to destroy, to truly engage allowed the Confederacy to survive crucial early tests and extend the conflict. The parade of other early Union generals, McDowell, Pope, Burnside, Hooker, each offered their own brand of limited success or outright failure, contributing to the prolonged stalemate. McDowell overwhelmed at first Bull Run. Pope outmaneuvered at second Bull Run. Burnside disastrously defeated at Fredericksburg. Hooker outflanked at Chancellorsville. Each of these commanders, for various reasons, failed to harness the Union's superior resources to deliver a decisive blow, often due to tactical errors, lack of aggressive pursuit, or an inability to adapt to the new realities of rifled muskets and entrenched positions. The constant turnover in leadership created strategic instability and gave the Confederacy valuable time to consolidate its defenses and regroup after costly battles. It was in the Western theater that a new breed of Union commander began to emerge. Ulysses S. Grant, initially dismissed by some as an alcoholic failure, proved to be Lincoln's most valuable discovery. Grant understood the concept of attrition instinctively. For him, war was about destroying the enemy's capacity and will to fight relentlessly. His campaigns in the West, Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, Shiloh, Vicksburg, Chattanooga, were characterized by an unyielding determination to seize objectives, a willingness to fight through heavy losses, and a stubborn refusal to retreat. He did not seek glorious, bloodless victories. He sought to grind down the enemy, to wear them out, to make them bleed. This was a direct embrace of the principle of prolonged, continuous engagement, a precursor to the total war that would ultimately define the latter half of the conflict. When Grant was brought east in 1864 and given overall command of Union armies, he brought this ruthless philosophy with him. His overland campaign against Robert E. Lee was a stark departure from previous Union efforts. Instead of seeking to maneuver Lee out of position or capture Richmond as a primary objective, Grant aimed to destroy Lee's army. The battles of the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, and Cold Harbor were unprecedented in their continuous nature and their staggering casualty tolls. Grant explicitly stated, "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer." He accepted immense losses, knowing that unlike Lee, he could replace his men. This was the grim arithmetic of total war, applied with unwavering resolve. Accompanying Grant's brutal effectiveness was William Tecumseh Sherman, another general who fully embraced the philosophy of total war. Sherman understood that to break the Confederacy's will, it was not enough to defeat its armies. Its economic and psychological capacity to wage war had to be destroyed. His march to the sea and subsequent campaign through the Carolinas were devastating manifestations of this philosophy. Union armies, detached from their supply lines, lived off the land, destroying infrastructure, railroads, factories, and crops. While controversial, these campaigns deliberately targeted civilian resources, aiming to demonstrate the futility of continued resistance and to make the costs of war unbearable for the Southern populace. This evolution from cautious, limited warfare to ruthless, total war was a painful but necessary step towards ending the conflict. The Confederacy, particularly under Robert E. Lee, initially benefited from the Union's strategic indecision and the cautious nature of its early commanders. Lee, a tactical genius, was able to win stunning victories against numerically superior forces, thereby sustaining the Confederate will to fight and prolonging the conflict. However, even Lee's brilliance could not overcome the inevitable grinding pressure of Grant and Sherman's relentless total war. The decision for the Union to eventually embrace total war, to adopt commanders who understood the necessity of continuous pressure and the destruction of the enemy's economic base, directly led to the final stages of the war. But this evolution took time, precious years of trial, error, and immense bloodshed. Had a Grant or a Sherman been in overall command from the outset, adopting a similar strategy, it is conceivable the war's duration might have been significantly shorter. The long, agonizing period of strategic indecision and the failure to fully commit to total war by the Union in the early years were, therefore, crucial in prolonging the slaughter, forcing a protracted and horrifying struggle for both sides until the ultimate, brutal lesson was learned. Was victory to be achieved through a purely defensive posture, outlasting Northern resolve and hoping for foreign intervention? Or did it necessitate audacious offensive gambits, striking into enemy territory to force a decisive battle and break the Union's will? This unresolved question and the often conflicting decisions born from it significantly prolonged the war as the Confederacy desperately sought a path to independence that ultimately proved elusive. While the Union struggled with its internal strategic compass, the Confederacy faced its own profound dilemma, a strategic tug-of-war that mirrored its existential struggle. Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, largely favored a defensive strategy. He believed in the inherent advantages of fighting on home soil, utilizing interior lines, and relying on the defensive power of the rifle in prepared positions. His vision was often one of coordinated, strategic defense, drawing the Union deep into Southern territory where their supply lines would be stretched, and their morale sapped by constant, frustrating engagements. This cordon defense approach, however, often resulted in scattered forces and an inability to concentrate strength against major Union thrusts. However, a different, more aggressive philosophy resonated with many of the Confederacy's most brilliant field commanders, particularly Robert E. Lee. Lee understood that a purely defensive war, while perhaps preserving the army for a time, could not win independence against the North's overwhelming numerical and industrial superiority. He believed the Confederacy needed to win a decisive victory on Union soil, a battle so cataclysmic that it would shatter Northern morale, discredit Lincoln's government, and, crucially, compel European powers to intervene on the side of the South. These were not military objectives in isolation. They were deeply political. This fundamental strategic tension led to a series of critical decisions that, while achieving tactical successes, ultimately prolonged the war and drained the Confederacy of its irreplaceable manpower. Lee's two major invasions of the North, the Maryland Campaign culminating at Antietam in 1862, and the Gettysburg Campaign in 1863, were direct manifestations of this offensive gambit. At Antietam, Lee's objectives were manifold: relieve pressure on Richmond, gather supplies in the fertile Maryland countryside, and most importantly, influence the upcoming Northern elections and encourage European recognition. The battle itself was the bloodiest single day in American history, a tactical stalemate that forced Lee's retreat. While it provided Lincoln the opportunity to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, it failed to achieve Lee's strategic goals of securing foreign aid or breaking Northern morale. The Confederacy's strategic gamble had not paid off, yet the immense cost of the battle prolonged the struggle by demonstrating the South's continued capacity for fierce, if ultimately unsuccessful, resistance. Gettysburg, a year later, represented an even more desperate throw of the dice. Fresh off a stunning victory at Chancellorsville, Lee again pushed north, believing a decisive victory could still force a favorable peace. The three-day battle was an epic clash of titans, culminating in Pickett's charge, a suicidal frontal assault against heavily entrenched Union positions. The defeat was devastating. The Army of Northern Virginia suffered irreplaceable losses, and any realistic hope of foreign intervention vanished. This offensive, while bold, was a profound drain on the Confederacy's limited resources, extending the war by confirming the North's resolve and denying the South a quick diplomatic exit. These offensive gambits, born from the Confederacy's desperate hope for a quick resolution through external pressure, directly contradicted the more conservative defensive strategy favored by Davis and many other generals. The constant debate between concentrating forces for defense and launching risky offensives often led to a lack of cohesion in overall Confederate strategy. Resources were sometimes diverted, armies were weakened by detachments, and vital defensive positions were occasionally left vulnerable in pursuit of a grand, war-ending blow that never materialized. The Western theater also saw similar strategic tensions, while generals like Braxton Bragg and Joseph E. Johnston often preferred defensive operations. The need to protect vital railway hubs and agricultural lands led to costly battles like Chickamauga and Atlanta, which, despite fierce fighting, ultimately saw the Confederacy pushed further back. The sheer territorial expanse of the Confederacy, while an advantage for defense, also meant that its limited forces were constantly stretched thin, reacting to Union thrusts on multiple fronts. The Confederacy's strategic dilemma was a cruel catch-22. A purely defensive war seemed doomed to slow strangulation by the Union's superior resources. Yet offensive operations, while offering a slim chance of a decisive, war-ending victory, carried immense risks and often resulted in irreplaceable losses that further hastened their decline. Each choice, whether defensive or offensive, whether cautious or audacious, ultimately prolonged the slaughter by keeping the Confederacy in the fight, often against overwhelming odds, hoping for a miracle that would never come. Their tenacious, often brilliant resistance born from this agonizing strategic quandary ensured that the final collapse would be protracted, brutal, and utterly devastating. While the grand armies clashed in bloody encounters on land, a silent, yet equally critical struggle unfolded on the seas and rivers: the naval war. Often overshadowed by the epic land campaigns, the Union's naval strategy, particularly the blockade of southern ports, was a slow-acting but ultimately decisive weapon. Its implementation, and the Confederacy's desperate efforts to counter it, became a profound, long-term factor in prolonging the conflict, transforming it into a grinding siege on a national scale. From the outset, the Union's naval objective was clear: to strangle the Confederacy economically. The Anaconda Plan, dismissed by some as overly cautious, relied heavily on the effectiveness of a naval blockade stretching over 3,500 miles of Confederate coastline. This was a monumental undertaking, requiring a vast fleet to patrol numerous bays, inlets, and river mouths, from the Chesapeake Bay to the Texas coast. Initially, the blockade was porous, more of a sieve than a solid wall, allowing many blockade runners to slip through with vital supplies and outbound cotton. This early inefficiency, largely due to the sheer scale of the task and the limited number of Union warships, contributed to the war's prolongation, as the Confederacy could still sustain itself for months, even years, through illicit trade. However, the Union's industrial might and shipbuilding capacity gradually turned the tide. Northern shipyards churned out new vessels at an astonishing rate. Wooden warships were quickly supplemented and eventually supplanted by innovative ironclads. The most famous early clash of these armored giants, the Battle of Hampton Roads in March 1862, between the USS Monitor and the CSS Virginia, formerly the USS Merrimack, signaled a new era of naval warfare. While the battle was a draw, it rendered every wooden warship in the world obsolete overnight. The Union, with its superior industrial base, could build more of these new, powerful vessels, further tightening the noose around the Confederacy. The blockade was not merely a passive act of patrolling. It involved a series of amphibious assaults aimed at seizing key southern ports, providing bases for the Union fleet, and denying the Confederacy vital access to the sea. New Orleans, captured in April 1862 by Admiral David Farragut's fleet, was a massive blow to the Confederacy's economic viability and morale. Later, Mobile Bay and Wilmington, Fort Fisher, fell, progressively squeezing the life out of the Southern economy. Each successful naval capture, though often requiring significant time and resources, contributed to the relentless attrition that prolonged the Confederacy's ability to fight. The Confederacy, recognizing the existential threat posed by the blockade, desperately sought ways to break it. Lacking the industrial capacity to build a conventional navy capable of challenging the Union's growing might, they turned to innovation and unconventional warfare. They developed a small fleet of commerce raiders, like the infamous CSS Alabama and CSS Florida, which roamed the world's oceans, sinking Union merchant ships and disrupting northern trade. While these raiders inflicted significant economic damage and diverted Union resources for their pursuit, they ultimately had no impact on the blockade itself or the outcome of the war. More significantly, the Confederacy pioneered the use of torpedoes, mines, and submersible vessels. The CSS Hunley, the first submarine to sink an enemy warship, the USS Housatonic, was a testament to Southern ingenuity. These innovations, while demonstrating remarkable courage and inventiveness, were often unreliable, dangerous for their own crews, and deployed on too small a scale to meaningfully challenge the Union's overwhelming naval supremacy. They were pinpricks against an ever-tightening grip. The prolonged nature of the blockade and the Confederacy's inability to effectively counter it meant that the South was slowly starved of essential goods, medicines, weapons, clothing, and even food. Inflation soared to astronomical levels as imported goods became luxury items. The inability to export cotton meant that the Confederacy lacked the foreign currency desperately needed to finance its war effort and purchase supplies abroad. This economic strangulation, a direct consequence of the sustained naval campaign, gradually undermined the Confederacy's ability to sustain its armies and its home front. The naval war, therefore, did not provide a quick, decisive blow. Instead, it contributed to a long, drawn-out process of attrition and economic collapse. Each year the blockade grew tighter, each port fell, each blockade runner was captured. It extended the grinding agony of the war. It was a strategic choice that embraced the concept of a long conflict, knowing that superior resources would eventually tell. The Confederacy's desperate, often brilliant, but ultimately futile attempts to break free from this naval noose only served to highlight its deepening plight, ensuring that the final, devastating collapse would come not in a swift, glorious battle, but after years of slow, painful strangulation. The war on the waves, therefore, contributed immensely to the prolongation of the overall slaughter, transforming it into a war of economic endurance as much as military might. While the Eastern Theater often captured the headlines with its epic, if often indecisive, clashes between the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia, a different, more decisive form of warfare was unfolding in the vast expanse of the Western Theater. Here, away from the political spotlight of Washington and Richmond, a new kind of Union general, epitomized by Ulysses S. Grant, began to master the art of total war. His unrelenting pressure, his pragmatic acceptance of attrition, and his strategic focus on breaking the Confederacy's economic and logistical backbone were critical in prolonging the war in the West to its ultimate and crushing conclusion. The Western Theater encompassed a colossal geographical area, stretching from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River and south to the Gulf of Mexico. This vastness, with its navigable rivers providing arteries for Union advances, presented unique strategic challenges and opportunities. Unlike the Eastern Theater, where battles often ended with both sides retreating to lick their wounds, the Western campaigns frequently involved continuous pursuit, encirclement, and the systematic destruction of enemy resources. Grant's early campaigns established his hallmark style. The capture of Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in February 1862 was a pivotal moment. These victories, achieved with riverine forces and land armies working in concert, not only opened up the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, but also shattered the Confederate defensive line in Kentucky and Tennessee. Grant's demand for unconditional and immediate surrender at Donelson earned him national recognition and signaled a new, no-nonsense approach to warfare. The Battle of Shiloh in April 1862, however, truly revealed the brutal reality of total war in the West. It was the bloodiest battle in American history up to that point, a testament to the savagery of the fighting and Grant's grim determination. Despite being surprised and nearly routed on the first day, Grant refused to retreat, famously stating, "I can't spare the time to feel bad." He counterattacked the next day, pushing the Confederates back. Shiloh underscored that victories would be hard-won and costly, achieved through sheer endurance rather than brilliant maneuver alone. This acceptance of high casualties as the price of victory was a crucial shift that would define the war's later stages and, paradoxically, prolong it until the enemy was utterly broken. The most significant Western campaign was the Vicksburg Campaign in 1863. Vicksburg, a formidable Confederate stronghold perched high on cliffs overlooking the Mississippi River, was vital. Its capture would give the Union complete control of the Mississippi, splitting the Confederacy in two and severing its vital supply lines from the Trans-Mississippi West. Grant's campaign was a masterclass in operational brilliance. After numerous failed attempts, he boldly marched his army south of Vicksburg, crossed the Mississippi, and then, abandoning his own supply lines, moved rapidly inland, defeating several Confederate armies in detail before laying siege to the city. The siege of Vicksburg, lasting 47 days, was a brutal war of attrition, with both civilians and soldiers enduring immense suffering. Its fall on July 4, 1863, the day after Gettysburg, was a double blow that irrevocably sealed the Confederacy's fate in the West. The fall of Vicksburg, combined with the earlier capture of New Orleans by Farragut, meant that the Anaconda Plan was largely fulfilled in the Western theater. The Mississippi River, the Confederacy's vital artery, was now firmly in Union hands. This systematically denied the Confederacy access to crucial supplies and manpower from the West, isolating a significant portion of its territory and effectively strangling its economic lifeblood. This grinding, patient strategy of cutting off vital resources was not a quick, decisive blow, but a slow, agonizing process that systematically weakened the Confederacy over months and years, thereby prolonging the slaughter to its inevitable conclusion. Following Vicksburg, Grant secured Chattanooga, opening the door for William T. Sherman's subsequent campaigns. Sherman, a close confidant of Grant, embraced an even more aggressive form of total war, explicitly targeting civilian resources and the psychological will of the Southern populace. His capture of Atlanta in September 1864, a vital railway hub and industrial center, was a profound blow to Confederate morale and provided a crucial boost to Lincoln's re-election chances. His subsequent march to the Sea and Carolina campaign would further exemplify this ruthless strategy, devastating the economic capacity of the South and accelerating its collapse. The Western theater thus became the blueprint for the latter stages of the war. Grant's unyielding pressure, his willingness to accept heavy losses for strategic gains, and his focus on destroying the enemy's resources meant that campaigns were prolonged, bloody affairs, but ultimately decisive. The Confederate forces in the West, though fighting bravely, were constantly outmaneuvered, outsupplied, and ultimately overwhelmed by the sheer, grinding force of Union advances. This sustained, unrelenting attrition in the West, systematically dismantling the Confederacy piece by piece, ensured that the war would not end until the very last vestiges of Southern resistance were crushed, thereby prolonging the national trauma to its bitter, necessary end. With the Western theater largely secured, the focus of the war and its most agonizing chapter shifted decisively to the Eastern Front, specifically to the brutal, relentless clash between Ulysses S. Grant's Army of the Potomac and Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. This was not a war of maneuver, nor of quick, decisive battles. It was a grinding, attritional meat grinder, a direct confrontation that, more than any other campaign, epitomized the prolonged slaughter of the American Civil War. Grant's strategy, born from the lessons of the West, was to break Lee's army, no matter the cost, a decision that ensured the war would not end until one side was utterly exhausted. When Grant assumed overall command of all Union armies in March 1864, he immediately signaled a radical departure from previous Union strategy in the East. His predecessors had often sought to maneuver around Lee or capture Richmond, the Confederate capital, as their primary objective. Grant, however, understood that Richmond was a symbol, but Lee's army was the substance of the Confederacy's resistance in the East. "Wherever Lee goes," Grant famously declared, "there will I go also." His objective was simple: destroy Lee's army, even if it meant staggering casualties for his own. The Overland Campaign of May-June 1864 was the horrifying manifestation of this new, brutal approach. For 40-odd days, Grant and Lee engaged in a continuous series of battles unlike anything seen before in American history. From the dense, tangled undergrowth of the wilderness to the sprawling trenches of Spotsylvania Courthouse and the infamous, bloody assault at Cold Harbor, the fighting was relentless and the casualties astronomical. The battles themselves were often tactical draws or even Confederate tactical victories, but Grant refused to disengage and retreat as his predecessors had. Instead, after each bloody encounter, he would simply disengage, swing around Lee's flank and move further south, forcing Lee to react and reposition. This relentless pressure had a devastating effect on Lee's army. While the Union suffered appalling losses, over 50,000 casualties in just over a month, Grant could, thanks to the North's demographic and industrial advantages, replenish his ranks. For Lee, every casualty was irreplaceable. His veteran soldiers, hardened by years of fighting, were being bled white, their numbers dwindling with each passing engagement. The fighting spirit of the Army of Northern Virginia remained high, but its physical capacity was being systematically worn down. Cold Harbor, a horrific frontal assault that resulted in thousands of Union casualties in mere minutes, became a grim symbol of Grant's willingness to accept immense losses for his strategic objective. Despite the public outcry and the political pressure, Grant pressed on, understanding the brutal arithmetic. For every 2 Union soldiers he lost, Lee lost 1, and Lee could not afford those losses. This decision to prioritize attrition over maneuver, to engage in continuous, high-casualty fighting, was the central factor in prolonging the slaughter in the East, as it systematically ground down the Confederacy's primary fighting force. The Overland Campaign culminated in the Siege of Petersburg, a vital railway hub south of Richmond. This evolved into a 9-month-long trench warfare stalemate, a brutal precursor to the Western Front of World War I. Both armies dug extensive lines of fortifications, engaging in constant skirmishing, artillery duels, and occasional, costly assaults. The siege was a test of endurance, logistics, and morale. For the Confederacy, it was a slow, agonizing death by 1,000 cuts. Their lines grew thin, their supplies dwindled, and their soldiers, many barefoot and starving, faced the grim reality of a war they could not win. While the siege dragged on, Sherman's devastating march through the Carolinas further isolated Lee. The destruction of vital railways and food sources in Georgia and South Carolina meant that supplies for Richmond and Petersburg became almost impossible to obtain. The Confederacy was being strangled, not just militarily, but economically and logistically. The hard hand of war was closing its iron fist around the last vestiges of Confederate resistance. In the first days of April 1865, Grant launched a final, decisive offensive that cracked the Confederate lines at Petersburg. The Battle of Five Forks on April 1, a crushing Union victory led by Philip Sheridan, finally broke Lee's right flank. With his lines untenable and his army on the verge of complete encirclement, Lee sent a desperate telegram to Jefferson Davis. Richmond could no longer be held. The evacuation of Richmond on April 2, 1865, was a chaotic, heartbreaking spectacle. The Confederate government fled, and the city, set ablaze by retreating Confederates to prevent supplies from falling into Union hands, burned furiously. The symbol of the Confederacy, the city they had so fiercely defended for 4 long years, was lost, This final, forced abandonment was a direct consequence of Grant's prolonged, relentless pressure, a testament to the strategic attrition that had finally broken the back of the Army of Northern Virginia. Lee's emaciated army, now numbering barely 30,000 men, began a desperate retreat westward, hoping to link up with Joseph E. Johnston's army in North Carolina. But Grant, relentless as ever, pursued them relentlessly. Union cavalry, led by Sheridan, harassed their flanks, captured their supply wagons, and blocked their escape routes. The Confederate soldiers, exhausted, starved, and demoralized, collapsed by the thousands. Roads were littered with stragglers, abandoned equipment, and the dying. The pursuit culminated at Appomattox Courthouse. Lee's path was blocked, his last hope of resupply dashed, and his army surrounded. On April 9, 1865, realizing the utter futility of further bloodshed, Robert E. Lee formally surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia to Ulysses S. Grant. The meeting between the two great commanders, conducted with quiet dignity and respect, marked the effective end of the American Civil War. The final collapse was not sudden. It was the inevitable conclusion of a prolonged, attritional struggle. The decision, made implicitly and explicitly by the Union, to accept a long, grinding war, a war of numbers, resources, and unflinching determination, had finally yielded its devastating, yet necessary, dividend. The suffering had been immense, the losses staggering, but the Union's commitment to total victory, to breaking the Confederacy's will and capacity to fight, ensured that the slaughter, once prolonged, would reach its definitive, absolute end. Appomattox was not just a surrender. It was the final, exhausted gasp of a nation that had fought itself to the very brink of annihilation, a testament to the brutal, drawn-out process required to forge a new, unified America from the ashes of civil strife. As Grant relentlessly ground down Lee's army in the trenches of Petersburg, another, equally devastating, form of total war was unleashed upon the heartland of the Confederacy by General William Tecumseh Sherman. His campaigns in Georgia and the Carolinas were not merely military operations aimed at defeating enemy armies. They were profound psychological and economic assaults designed to break the Confederacy's will to resist. This ruthless, yet ultimately decisive, strategy prolonged the overall suffering by systematically dismantling the very fabric of Southern society, ensuring that the war would not end until the concept of organized resistance was utterly extinguished. Sherman, a close confidant of Grant, understood that the Confederacy's ability to wage war was inextricably linked to its civilian support and economic infrastructure. While armies fought, farms produced food, factories manufactured supplies, and railroads transported everything. To truly end the rebellion, Sherman reasoned, this support system had to be shattered. His objective was not just to defeat Confederate armies in the field, but to make the South howl, to demonstrate the futility of continued resistance by bringing the full, devastating force of war directly to its civilian population. The Atlanta Campaign of 1864 was the prelude. A vital railway hub and industrial center, Atlanta was crucial for the Confederacy's war effort. Sherman's methodical advance, characterized by flanking maneuvers and constant pressure against Joseph E. Johnston's skillful defensive tactics, was a masterclass in operational art. The eventual fall of Atlanta in September 1864, a tremendous blow to Confederate morale and a crucial boost to Northern spirits, especially Lincoln's re-election prospects. Yet the capture of a city, while significant, was only the beginning of Sherman's grand design. The decision to embark on the March to the Sea in November 1864 was audacious and strategically revolutionary. Cutting loose from his supply lines, Sherman's army of 60,000 men marched 285 miles from Atlanta to Savannah, living off the land and systematically destroying anything of military value and much that was not. Railroads were torn up, ties burned, and rails heated and twisted into Sherman's neckties. Factories were razed, cotton gins destroyed, and crops confiscated or put to the torch. While orders were given to avoid wanton destruction of private dwellings, the reality on the ground was often harsher, with foraging parties and stragglers committing acts of plunder and destruction. This was a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. The goal was to demoralize the civilian population, to show them that the Confederate government could not protect them, and to convince them that further resistance was hopeless. The sight of a massive Union army marching unimpeded through the heart of Georgia, destroying resources and demonstrating overwhelming power, was intended to break the spirit of the Confederacy. For the Southerners who experienced it firsthand, it was an unprecedented act of terror, a visceral demonstration of total war. The March to the Sea culminated in the capture of Savannah in December 1864, which Sherman famously presented to Lincoln as a Christmas present. But the devastation was far from over. From Savannah, Sherman turned north into the Carolinas, enacting an even harsher campaign of destruction. South Carolina, viewed by Union soldiers as the hellhole of secession, suffered the most severe treatment. Columbia, the state capital, was burned, a devastating fire whose precise origins remain debated but whose impact was undeniably horrific. The aim was clear: to inflict so much economic and psychological pain that the South would be forced to capitulate. The immediate consequence of Sherman's marches was not a quick end to the war, but a deepening of the Confederacy's agony. It prolonged the suffering by systematically stripping the South of its capacity to feed, clothe, and arm its remaining armies. The logistical burden on Lee's army, already immense, became unbearable as vital sources of supply were destroyed. The psychological blow, too, was profound, leading to widespread demoralization and an increase in desertion rates as soldiers learned of the devastation wrought upon their homes. Sherman's strategy was deeply controversial then, and remains so today. Critics decried it as barbaric and a violation of the laws of war. However, proponents argued it was a necessary evil, a bitter medicine required to end the protracted slaughter that was already consuming the nation. By making the cost of continued resistance unbearable, Sherman aimed to shorten the overall duration of the conflict, even if it meant intensifying the suffering for a finite period. The hard hand of war, exercised by Sherman, was a direct and agonizing method of prolonging the war in its final stages by systematically breaking the enemy's will and capacity to fight. It was a strategy born out of the brutal realization that the Confederacy would not simply surrender after battlefield defeats. It required the systematic destruction of their economic and social fabric, a process that, while immensely destructive, was ultimately deemed necessary to bring the protracted slaughter to its final, definitive, and devastating conclusion. As the relentless campaigns of Grant and Sherman bled the Confederacy dry, the Union faced its own existential crisis: the presidential election of 1864. This election, held in the midst of a brutal civil war, was far more than a routine political contest. It was a referendum on Abraham Lincoln's leadership, on the very purpose and duration of the war, and it became the Confederacy's last, desperate hope for a negotiated peace that would preserve their independence. The outcome of this election, balanced precariously on the shifting tides of public opinion and battlefield fortunes, was a pivotal decision point that could have profoundly prolonged or even fundamentally altered the ultimate course of the slaughter. By the summer of 1864, war weariness in the North was palpable. The seemingly endless casualty lists from Grant's overland campaign, the stalled siege of Petersburg, and the perception of a protracted, inconclusive struggle fueled widespread discontent. The cost in blood and treasure was immense, and many questioned if victory was truly achievable or worth the staggering price. The Copperheads, the anti-war faction of the Democratic Party, gained significant traction, openly advocating for an immediate armistice and peace talks. Lincoln himself faced a fractured political landscape. Within his own Republican Party, radical Republicans criticized him for being too slow on emancipation and too willing to compromise, while conservative elements worried about the radical direction of the war. His nomination for a second term was far from a certainty. The Democratic Party nominated George B. McClellan, Lincoln's former general, on a platform that, while ostensibly supporting the Union, largely advocated for an immediate armistice and peace talks. This platform, if successful, would have almost certainly led to a permanent division of the United States and a capitulation to Confederate demands, thereby prolonging the national conflict, albeit in a different form. For the Confederacy, the election of 1864 represented their final, desperate lifeline. They understood that their military might was waning, their resources dwindling, and their armies shrinking. Their only viable path to independence now lay not on the battlefield, but in the political arena of their adversary. If McClellan could defeat Lincoln, the Confederacy believed, a negotiated peace was within reach, saving their way of life and ending the war on their terms. This hope, however slim, fueled their continued, tenacious resistance in the face of overwhelming odds, directly prolonging the war by giving them a reason to endure the relentless Union onslaught. Lincoln himself was acutely aware of the stakes. In August 1864, deeply pessimistic about his re-election chances, he famously penned a sealed memorandum, asking his cabinet to sign it, pledging to assist his successor in preserving the Union should he be defeated. He recognized that a change in administration could undo all the sacrifices made and all the gains achieved. His commitment to fighting the war to a victorious conclusion, leading to the abolition of slavery and the full restoration of the Union, was unwavering. The turning point came in September 1864. Just weeks before the election, William Tecumseh Sherman's capture of Atlanta provided a desperately needed boost to Union morale. The fall of this vital Confederate city, combined with Farragut's victory at Mobile Bay, demonstrated tangible progress and convinced many weary Northerners that victory was indeed possible. The tide of public opinion began to shift. The perception of an endless, stalemated war gave way to a renewed sense of hope and purpose. The Democratic platform, particularly its call for an immediate armistice, also alienated some Union soldiers and voters who, despite their war weariness, were unwilling to surrender the gains already bought with so much blood. Lincoln's unshakable commitment to total victory, contrasted with McClellan's perceived willingness to compromise, ultimately resonated with enough voters to secure his re-election. Lincoln's resounding victory in November 1864, with a significantly larger popular vote margin than anticipated, was a clear mandate from the American people. It signaled an unequivocal rejection of a negotiated peace and an endorsement of the strategy of total war until complete Confederate surrender. This decision, made at the ballot box, sealed the Confederacy's fate. Their last hope for a political lifeline was extinguished. For the Confederacy, the re-election of Lincoln meant that the war would continue to its absolute, bitter end. There would be no compromise, no recognition of independence, no preservation of slavery. The only option left was to fight until complete exhaustion or surrender. This knowledge, this profound realization that their cause was now militarily and politically hopeless, yet still fiercely resisted, prolonged the final, agonizing months of the slaughter. The decision of the American electorate in 1864 to recommit to war for complete victory, therefore, ensured that the conflict would reach its inevitable, devastating conclusion, leaving no doubt as to the price paid for a reunited nation and a liberated people. The echoes of the last rifle shot had faded, the smoke from the last cannon cleared, and the weary armies disbanded. But the surrender at Appomattox, while marking the end of organized military resistance, was not the end of the American Civil War's profound and prolonged impact. The decision to fight this war to its bitter, total conclusion, the one decision that prolonged the slaughter, left an indelible legacy, shaping the nation for generations and revealing the immense, agonizing cost of preserving the Union and abolishing slavery. For 9 grueling months, from June 1864 to April 1865, the armies of Grant and Lee faced each other across a vast network of trenches and fortifications around Petersburg. This was a war of constant tension, of skirmishes, bombardments, and tunnel digging. The infamous Battle of the Crater, an attempt by Union engineers to blow a hole in the Confederate lines, resulted in a horrific Union defeat, a testament to the defensive power of entrenched positions and the continued ferocity of the fighting. Despite the tactical failures, Grant maintained his relentless pressure, extending his lines, gradually outflanking Lee's stretched and dwindling forces. The conditions within the Petersburg trenches were abysmal, particularly for the Confederates. Rations dwindled to nothing, disease was rampant, and desertion became a torrent. Many Confederate soldiers, ragged, starving, and knowing the futility of their cause, simply walked away from the lines, seeking to return to their desperate families. Lee, with his dwindling force, was fighting a losing battle against an enemy that could, and did, continually replenish its ranks. The very existence of his army was now dependent on a threadbare supply line and the sheer, defiant will of its emaciated soldiers. While the siege dragged on, Sherman's devastating march through the Carolinas further isolated Lee. The destruction of vital railways and food sources in Georgia and South Carolina meant that supplies for Richmond and Petersburg became almost impossible to obtain. The Confederacy was being strangled, not just militarily, but economically and logistically. The hard hand of war was closing its iron fist around the last vestiges of Confederate resistance. In the first days of April 1865, Grant launched a final, decisive offensive that cracked the Confederate lines at Petersburg. The Battle of Five Forks on April 1, a crushing Union victory led by Philip Sheridan, finally broke Lee's right flank. With his lines untenable and his army on the verge of complete encirclement, Lee sent a desperate telegram to Jefferson Davis. Richmond could no longer be held. The evacuation of Richmond on April 2, 1865, was a chaotic, heartbreaking spectacle. The Confederate government fled, and the city, set ablaze by retreating Confederates to prevent supplies from falling into Union hands, burned furiously. The symbol of the Confederacy, the city they had so fiercely defended for 4 long years, was lost. This final, forced abandonment was a direct consequence of Grant's prolonged, relentless pressure, a testament to the strategic attrition that had finally broken the back of the Army of Northern Virginia. Lee's emaciated army, now numbering barely 30,000 men, began a desperate retreat westward, hoping to link up with Joseph E. Johnston's army in North Carolina. But Grant, relentless as ever, pursued them relentlessly. Union cavalry, led by Sheridan, harassed their flanks, captured their supply wagons and blocked their escape routes. The Confederate soldiers, exhausted, starved, and demoralized, collapsed by the thousands. Roads were littered with stragglers, abandoned equipment, and the dying. The pursuit culminated at Appomattox Courthouse. Lee's path was blocked, his last hope of resupply dashed, and his army surrounded. On April 9, 1865, realizing the utter futility of further bloodshed, Robert E. Lee formally surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia to Ulysses S. Grant. The meeting between the two great commanders, conducted with quiet dignity and respect, marked the effective end of the American Civil War. The final collapse was not sudden. It was the inevitable conclusion of a prolonged, attritional struggle. The decision, made implicitly and explicitly by the Union, to accept a long, grinding war, a war of numbers, resources, and unflinching determination, had finally yielded its devastating, yet necessary, dividend. The suffering had been immense, the losses staggering, but the Union's commitment to total victory, to breaking the Confederacy's will and capacity to fight, ensured that the slaughter, once prolonged, would reach its definitive, absolute end. Appomattox was not just a surrender. It was the final, exhausted gasp of a nation that had fought itself to the very brink of annihilation, a testament to the brutal, drawn-out process required to forge a new, unified America from the ashes of civil strife. The echoes of the last rifle shot had faded, the smoke from the last cannon cleared, and the weary armies disbanded. But the surrender at Appomattox, while marking the end of organized military resistance, was not the end of the American Civil War's profound and prolonged impact. The decision to fight this war to its bitter, total conclusion, the one decision that prolonged the slaughter, left an indelible legacy, shaping the nation for generations and revealing the immense, agonizing cost of preserving the Union and abolishing slavery. The immediate aftermath was one of utter devastation, particularly in the South. Cities lay in ruins, railroads were twisted wrecks, and the agricultural economy, built on the now abolished system of slavery, was utterly shattered. Millions of newly freed African Americans faced an uncertain future, navigating a world of promised freedom but persistent racial hatred and economic hardship. The physical scars on the landscape were matched by the deep emotional and psychological wounds of 4 years of internecine conflict. The scale of death, approaching 750,000 soldiers, left an entire generation grieving, with countless families mourning fathers, sons, and brothers. Reconstruction, the period that followed, was itself a prolonged and often violent struggle to redefine American nationhood and citizenship. The very intensity of the war, prolonged by the Union's commitment to total victory, meant that the terms of peace were harsh, and the pathway to reconciliation fraught with immense difficulty. The South, having resisted to the point of utter collapse, harbored deep resentment towards the North and towards the new social order. The federal government, having fought so hard to preserve the Union, now faced the monumental task of rebuilding it, culturally and politically. The passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, abolishing slavery, granting citizenship and equal protection, and enfranchising black men, were direct, albeit belated, consequences of the war's ultimate trajectory. These were radical transformations, born from the crucible of total war, that would likely not have occurred had the conflict ended in a negotiated peace that left slavery intact. The prolonged slaughter, therefore, had a profound and ultimately transformative, if agonizingly achieved, moral outcome. However, the war's prolongation also intensified the deep divisions that would plague the nation for decades. The lost cause narrative in the South, romanticizing the Confederacy and downplaying slavery's role, emerged as a powerful cultural force, fueled by the sheer suffering endured and the desire to justify the immense sacrifices. This enduring cultural conflict, a legacy of the protracted struggle, continued to shape American identity and politics long after the guns fell silent. Economically, the war cemented the North's industrial dominance and set the stage for America's rise as a global economic power. The massive government spending, the expansion of industries, and the integration of national markets, all driven by the demands of a total war, propelled the United States into a new era of industrial capitalism. Conversely, the South remained economically crippled for generations, its agrarian society struggling to adapt to the post-slavery world, a direct consequence of the prolonged economic warfare waged by the Union. The impact on military thought was equally profound. The Civil War foreshadowed the total wars of the 20th century, demonstrating the devastating power of industrial warfare, the importance of logistics, and the grim reality of attrition. Commanders like Grant and Sherman, once controversial, came to be seen as prescient figures who understood the brutal necessities of modern conflict. The lessons learned, often at immense cost, would inform military doctrine for decades to come. Ultimately, the one decision that prolonged the slaughter, the Union's eventual, unwavering commitment to total war to achieve unconditional surrender and the complete abolition of slavery, created a legacy of paradox. It was a decision that ensured unimaginable suffering and widespread destruction, drawing out the conflict for years beyond initial expectations. Yet, it was also the decision that secured the integrity of the United States as a single, indivisible nation, and crucially, liberated 4 million enslaved people. The Civil War, in its agonizing prolongation, forced America to confront its foundational contradictions. It was the nation's bloody reckoning with itself, a necessary, albeit horrific, purgatorial fire that burned away the old order and forged a new, if still imperfect, union. The cost was immense, measured in lives, shattered families, and scarred landscapes. But the outcome, a truly free and unified nation, was a testament to the fact that sometimes the longest, most painful path is the only one that leads to true, transformative change. The slaughter was prolonged, but the outcome, for good or ill, was definitive, settling the great questions that had tormented the Republic since its inception, ensuring that the legacy of that agonizing period would echo through every facet of American life, down to the present day.